I'm Bud, and I'm an alcoholic. And it's truly because of God's grace in this program and a lot of help from a lot of people that I'm sober today. And I've been blessed with sobriety one day at a time since the 17th of August of 1970, and for this I am truly grateful. I am very sorry that Bill wasn't here. I've known this gentleman for about 6 years, and he became my sponsor. We were working up in Missouri together, and the guy is truly a prince of a man. And he lives this and practices it in his life. And I guess the reason he may have called me is because just last July I went through this same thing and lost my father, and long distance he went through it with me. And so I felt very proud when he called and asked me to substitute. Now I know there's a story about substitute and prostitute, but I can't remember what it is right now. John and I were talking about that while I was trying to eat dinner tonight. Are y'all having fun yet? All right. I want to take this opportunity to thank the committee. I appreciate all they've done. I appreciate the way they've taken and helped me get comfortable, introduced me to people, and really made me feel comfortable at home. And I felt the love and the warmth in this 32nd Jamboree. It's been a great experience for me. I was a little bit perplexed when I got here. I was picked up at the airport the same time Pam was. And we came down, we were registering out here, and y'all saw Pam yesterday evening. She did a beautiful job, beautiful job. We were signing in out here, and I was standing on one side and she was over here, and I was just kind of looking at this column and looking around, and she was bending over, and she's well endowed, and I was kind of looking, and I heard this guy standing behind her saying, "Don't hide those, honey. I'll clean them up for you." And I looked around, and I thought, I can't be hearing this right. And he looked at me and he said, "I'll clean yours up too." And I said, I knew I was in the wrong place. He was a jeweler. He was talking about her stones that she was wearing. I got comfortable immediately as soon as I heard that. Gene was talking earlier today, and he was talking about the fact that he was born. And that's about where my alcoholism started, when I was born. But as I was growing up, I grew up in a home where my father was a member of this fellowship. And he had been a member since 1945. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to put continuous sobriety together. He was able to put 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, 10 months, 11 months. He couldn't get a year put together. It took him 15 years to get a year birthday. But he kept coming back. But as I was growing up, I was around AA and I was around this fellowship, and I didn't understand what was going on. My father would come home, and he'd have alcohol on his breath, and my mother would react, and then she'd send me out in the garage to find out where his stash was and to find out what he was drinking, because she wanted to know whether it was wine or whiskey, because he got mean when he drank wine, and he passed out when he drank whiskey. So she wanted to know what kind of evening we were in for, and I used to go out there and I used to climb around out there and find out. I remember we had our first television set when I was 8 years old. We had one of them Hoffman Easy Vision television sets. I don't know if y'all remember those. And my folks used to go to the AA meetings on Friday night, and I'd stay home. And while they were gone, they had these Western movies on TV. And I'd see these good guys and these bad guys, and they'd walk in there, and they'd walk up to the bar, and they'd pour them a drink, and they'd toss it down, and they'd just get mellow all over, And I'd get up, and I'd go in the kitchen, and my dad had a little shot glass in there, and I'd get that shot glass, and I'd get a Coca-Cola, and I'd come in there, and I'd practice drinking out of a shot glass when I was 8 years old. They talk about in the big book having an alcoholic mind, and I believe I had one from the very beginning. As I got older, I used to hear them talking about these other people that were my age, and they were growing up, and they were talking about these nice kids. Isn't it nice that old Johnny does such and such? Isn't he a little gentleman? Isn't he respectful, And I'd think, I got to be like little Johnny if people are going to talk nicely about me. And then I'd hear them talking about somebody else and the things that they did, and I'd plant this seed in my mind. I got to be like old so-and-so so that I'll be well thought of. And all my life growing up, that's what I did. I listened and I mimicked and I did these things, and I didn't have my own identity. And I didn't know who I was. And I always compared, and I never measured up. I didn't know what to do. You know, they come around and they ask you when you're growing up, what do you want to be when you grow up? Hell, I didn't know what I wanted to be then. You know, I didn't know how to be a kid. I didn't know how to relax. You know, I didn't know how to be comfortable. I didn't know how to have a sense of humor. I was all the time a knot in my stomach. And I wanted to be loved, and I wanted to be liked. And I did the things to get the praise, and I did all these things, and you know what was ironic about it? Every time I'd get that praise, or I'd do something that was an achievement, and they'd come around and pat me on the back, I'd smile, and then I'd think, if you really knew me, though, you wouldn't be patting me on the back. Because all I was presenting to them was an image. I was projecting an image so that they would like me. And where I got off on not being likable, I don't know, but that's part of my illness. I grew up in a good Catholic home. I see some of the clergy here tonight. I think there's one benefit of growing up in a Catholic home. It saves you years of drinking. When you start drinking, you got immediate guilt and remorse, and you can get here quicker, you know. Now, you got to take that with a grain of salt, you know. I had the Sisters of the Incarnate Word that helped raise me. I went to a little Catholic church and school there in Amarillo, Texas, and they had confession every morning before church, and then the nuns would stand up there in the front of the church and watch. And you were supposed to, when it's time for communion, get out of there and go up and get your communion and come back around and sit down, and every time you did that, they'd nod their head and they'd smile at you, you know. And if you didn't do that, they looked at you terribly. And I used to get a lot of those terrible looks, you know. My problem was, they told me when I was growing up, it's as bad to think it as it is to do it. Have you ever heard that deal? I knew I wasn't going to get to heaven, so why make the trip, you know. I didn't have a very good relationship with my higher power. I tried to get good. Yeah, I couldn't make it. I couldn't get good enough. I did well in lots of things, but I never felt good. Did y'all ever feel good? You know, some of you guys shaking your head, you understand. You know, I saw them good people. There's a glow about them. They kind of just drift through life, you know. Just, they do real well, and I was looking at them and I was watching them, I was stumbling all the way, you know. But something miraculous happened to me. When I was 14 years old, I took a drink. And I took another drink. And pretty soon, for the first time in my life, I felt like it was to be comfortable, to be normal, to be human, to be at peace, to don't give a shit, you know. First time I relaxed. Excuse my language, ladies. But that's the way it was. You know, that's the way it was. I mellowed out, and immediately I had a sense of humor. You know, I liked myself. But I didn't stop there. I thought if you can feel a little bit good, by God, you ought to drink a little more, and I did. And you know what happened to me? Had a personality change the first time. Got mean. Felt like King Kong. You know, got in a scrap immediately. I grew up in a home where it was construction background. Two of the main things they measured your worth by was how much you can drink and how much you can fight and win. They don't like them losers around my house. And I drank, and I got in a fight, and I won, and I was addicted. I was addicted to the fact that I finally measured up in my dad's eyes. You know, that's hell. But for the first time, I was able to get out there and do what he expected of me, and I wasn't scared to death because I had enough alcohol in me where it didn't make any difference. And that started a pattern in my life that continued and continued and continued. And I started blacking out. And I started going to jail when I was 15 years old. And I wasn't a criminal, but I just had a bad attitude. And I'd wind up in that jailhouse, you know. And they'd threaten me, and they'd do all these things with me, you know. And I thought to myself, if that's the price that I got to pay to finally get some relief, hell, it's worth it. You know, it's worth it. I'll pay that price. The thing about it is that my disease progressed so rapidly that in just a few short years, you know, I was, well, you know, I did what Gene did. Hell, I joined the Marine Corps. You know, Vietnam was going on. You think I had any sanity? No. I joined the Marine Corps. I go off and I get in boot camp and I get this uniform on and I'm walking around and all of a sudden I'm even more scared than I was before. I couldn't be a man, and now I'm trying to be a man and a Marine, and I can't measure up. And so I had to drink more, and the loneliness and the fear and the insecurities and the inadequacies inside of me just kept growing and growing and growing. My head hurt. My shoulders hurt. My neck hurt. I was rigid all the time. I was rigid with fear. And the more afraid that I got, the more I kept people away from me. And the more afraid I got, the more glare in my eyes started to come out to keep people away. And if you looked at me, and you looked at me very long, and you looked at me very closely, I'd walk up to you and I'd say, you got a problem? Because I didn't want you to look inside of me and see what was going on inside of me. And I couldn't tell anybody what was going on inside of me. I was 19 years old, and they treated me for malnutrition. Because I had enough money, I was on independent duty in San Francisco, and I had enough money to either drink or to eat, but I didn't have money to do both. And you knew what I was going to do. I drank. And they treated me for malnutrition when I was 19, and the doctor said, I want you to go see the psychiatrist. And I knew if I went over and talked to that psychiatrist, they'd lock me away. And I didn't do it. This point in my life was probably the most overwhelming, devastating time of my life. I wasn't even of age to be a man legally, and I was drinking to the point to where I was drunk every day. And I had to get drunk to survive. And the personality change kept getting worse, and the blackouts kept getting worse, and I kept getting more violent. And I kept having to prove that I wasn't afraid, and the fear kept getting more and more every day. And I didn't know what to do. And I lived on the 7th floor of an apartment building in San Francisco, and it had those bay windows on Gary Street. And I'd sit there in that bay window, and I'd look down on the street, and these people would be walking down the street, and they had a place to go and a purpose and somebody to be with, and I envied those people. I wanted to be like them, not for what they had materially, not for anything. I wanted to belong. I wanted to belong to the human race, and I couldn't belong to the human race. They talk about a dilemma. I was a dilemma. A bad one. And I kept drinking. And I kept getting more trouble. It got so bad that when people would walk down the street, and there'd be 3 or 4 guys walking down the street, I'd back up and put my back against the wall, and I'd walk them past by me, because I did not know if those were the folks that I'd been in a hit the night before or not, because I was in blackouts so much. And I lived like that, daily. And I'd get in that room, and I'd bolt that door, and I'd sit up there, and I didn't know what to do next. And I couldn't cry, because you can't be a Marine and cry. And I couldn't show fear, because you can't be a Marine and show fear. And I was scared to death. And I wasn't getting any relief from my drinking, folks. I wasn't having joy, peace, happiness, fun. I don't know what fun is. I never had fun. I got normal and went downhill from there. I didn't get high. Some folks get high. Hell, I just got to normal, and that didn't last long. I remember It dawned on me. The Marine Corps done everything to try to sober me up. Cost me 6 more months. I did 4.5 years in the Marine Corps on a 4-year enlistment. I did 4.5 years to get out with an honorable discharge. If that tells you anything. They decided that maybe I ought to get settled down, you know. So I decided I'd get married. Now, with my attitude like it was, I didn't have any women acquaintances. I didn't even have a girlfriend. I didn't even have a lady I'd call by her first name. It costs money to have girlfriends. You got to buy them drinks and be nice to them. You know, when I was drinking, if somebody wanted to sit down with me, a lady, I'd ask her if she had her own damn money, because I wasn't going to buy her nothing. They'd sit down there about 5 or 10 minutes and they'd leave. You know? But anyway, this seemed like the good idea, because if I didn't do something, they were going to bury me again, you know. So I told them, well, I'll fly back. They gave me 10 days emergency leave to go back to Amarillo, Texas, and to find a wife. This was emergency leave. I'd already used up my other leave. This was emergency leave. So the guys that I was in that outfit with there in San Francisco gave me a going-away party, because they knew I was going to be successful. God, they had optimists, internal optimists. And I got on that airplane, and I was drunk when I got on there, and I was drunk when I got off. And I started going around to all these gals that I knew when I was growing up, and I was asking them to marry me. Boy, I wished I'd have kept tape recording of those answers. They became very emphatic when they told me no. They told me you were crazy before you went, and now you're even worse shape than when you... And I was terrible. But goddamn, I only had 10 days, and you had to hurry every chance you get, you know. Well, it don't take long to run through a short list of candidates, you know. And I was out. I was out of my list. And I didn't have any candidates. But I kept drinking, and I had faith. First time I knew what faith was, you know. And I had faith, and I kept drinking, and I kept looking, and I found one that said maybe. That's the best I could do. And I flew back. Ladies, don't get upset with me. I flew back to San Francisco, and it took me 6 months to convince her that she could come out there and straighten me out. It wouldn't have taken that long, but my mother was working on her in Amarillo trying to tell her how sick I really was. She wasn't real bright, because she went ahead and come on out there and tried. Would somebody bring me an ashtray, please? I got to smoke. Thank you. It starts to get interesting now, you know. I got married, you know, because I knew home-cooked meals and TV and all that stuff. By God, I'd be all right, you know. And it worked for about 15 minutes, you know. Well, it almost didn't work that long. These guys that were in my ceremony were holding them sabers, you know. Supposed to be an arch. What it was, an obstacle course, you know. And I got through that deal, and she got through that deal, and we got through that little reception we had. Where was I going to take her to introduce her as my wife? Hell, all I had was friends in bars and bartenders. And that's how long it worked. So then I had this thought come into my mind. It's just because you're in San Francisco. If you were somewhere else and had an opportunity to start over, I mean, you're newly married and you're responsible and you're doing all these things. If you just get to another place where they don't know you, you'll be all right. They gave me a transfer to Kansas City. You know, I got to Kansas City, going to start over, right? First thing I did is I walked through that installation and I looked for them guys that had that ruddy complexion and them bloodshot eyes. And they became my friends, you know, immediately. And it started over. And it got worse. And every day this was getting more progressive. And the scraps didn't stop, you know, and the blackouts didn't stop, and the fear didn't stop. There was more fear. There was more fear now because I was supposed to be responsible on top of all that other stuff. I was supposed to be taking care of somebody. I was supposed to be worthwhile. I didn't want to be that way. I didn't know how to be that way. Nobody gave me any course on human relations. Nobody taught me how to be a human being. So then I thought, well, maybe it's just the military life. Maybe if you just go home, get back home and get in civilian life and go to church and be around people that know you, maybe it'll get better. And I went home. In 12 months, in less than 12 months, I wiped out every friend that I ever had in Amarillo, Texas. I was crazy, people. I'd go to church on Sunday. If I was standing by the side door, everybody went out the front door. If I was standing by the front door, they went out the side door. They didn't want to talk to me. I got 86th out of every bar on West 6th and East 6th in Amarillo, Texas. There's a lot of bars up there. I was the kind of guy that I'd sit there, and then I'd destroy the place. I never got picked up for disturbing the peace. I got jailed for inciting riots. That's the honest to God truth. You can go back there and look. I couldn't stand serenity and peace. I couldn't stand people just enjoying themselves and having a good time. I didn't like it. It upset me. It upset me because I couldn't be that way. And I'd hurt people, and I'd hurt myself. My wardrobe, hell, I didn't have a wardrobe by the time I got sober. Jackets used to get ripped off. I never had a piece. I didn't have any jackets left when I got to AA. That's the first thing they rip off of you when you get in a scrap, is they take your jacket off. I didn't have any jackets left. I'm lucky I got here at all. I was so paranoid, and I share this with you. We've been running a little late. I was so paranoid that I would sit in a bar sometimes during the day, and you know how they're dim, and people come in from the outside where the sun's shining, and they get in there, and they blink their eyes, and they look around, and they try to get oriented. And I used to sit at the bar, and I'd see them do that, and I thought they were giving me a dirty look. You know? And I'd sit there on my bar stool, and I'd be thinking and drinking, and that's dangerous. You know, have you ever tried to think when you're drinking? It's terrible. And I'd think if I don't go over there and say something to them, if I don't go do something, they're going to put the word out that I'm a pansy. And if the word gets out that I'm a pansy, they're going to kill me. And I'm serious. And I'd sit there, and then I'd get up and I'd go down there, and they didn't even know I was around. They didn't know I was in the universe, and I'd knock them off their bar stool and stomp them. I'd do whatever it took. And I didn't like myself, and I didn't like what was going on. And I didn't know what to do about it. You see, this was back in 1967, 68 years old, 68. I was 23 years old when I got to the program the first time in 1968. The next closest youngest person to me in the AA program at that time was 35. I was too young to be an alcoholic. Alcoholism wasn't an accepted disease back then for young people. I was crazy when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I came to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, people, because I didn't have anywhere else to go. The last thing that I tried to do before I joined AA is I joined the Knights of Columbus. I mean, I was trying. I joined the Knights of Columbus. In 3 weeks, the Grand Knight calls up one Sunday morning and tells me to never come back to his deal again. He says, "You got a bad attitude, man." I did. It's terrible. I come to AA. By the time I got to AA the first time, people were tired of messing with me, and they started putting them revolvers right here between my eyes to stop the fight. And they started clubbing me, and they started doing whatever it took to get me to a point to where I could be controlled. And I come in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I walk in there, and my father was going to that group. It was a Top of Texas group, the only one we had there in Amarillo at that time. And I walked in there, and they all thought I was down there because of my dad, because I was too young. And they'd pat me on the head, and they'd tell me how nice it is that I could come in before I had to hurt. You know? If y'all ever put that deal on a young person, don't do it anymore. And I come in there, And some of these old-timers back then, would come up to me and they'd say, "Are you down here for yourself?" And I'd say, "Yeah." "You mean to try and tell me that you're an alcoholic?" And I said, "Yeah." I still had a bad attitude, And they'd say, "By God, I spilt more than you ever drank." And I'd say, "Well, you must have been a clumsy son of a bitch then." I didn't want to be in AA, But I didn't want to be where I was at either. And I went to meetings, and I gritted my teeth and I clenched my fists and I'd go to those meetings and I wouldn't drink. And these guys would walk around and they'd have happiness and peace and serenity all over their face. I didn't like them. It didn't get any better, And I kept looking. Have y'all ever done this? You've been in AA and you know you're going to drink again, and every time something comes up in your life, you weigh it out to find out if it's serious enough so that you can go get drunk so they won't think you're copping out. Huh? I was still worried about my image. I'd go in them meetings, I was out there working. I was trying to be a nice guy. I was doing all these beautiful things, carrying that paycheck home, being responsible, not drinking. Something that happened in my life, I'd weigh it out. Wasn't serious enough, and I'd get mad. I'd go back to some more meetings, Something else bad had happened, I'd weigh it out. Wasn't bad enough, I'd go back. God, I was getting impatient. This went on for 1 year and 3 months. Really, white-knuckle sobriety all the way. Them folks kept loving me. My mother-in-law, my brother-in-law, and my sister-in-law came down from Oklahoma. They wanted to come down and see the little baby, my oldest daughter. They come down, they're supposed to stay 2 or 3 days, and then they're going to go back to Oklahoma. 3 weeks later, they're still in my house. I had a little 2-bedroom house in Amarillo, wasn't big enough to cuss a cat in, and they had moved in. My brother-in-law's car broke down, couldn't go to work. So by God, I bought him a work car. He still didn't go to work. I'm working. I even tried to clean up my language at that time. I thought you could be good and this bird of paradise would fly over and drop a load of serenity on you. I was working at that, being good, and somebody shot the bird. He never showed up, I didn't have serenity. I had stark raven sobriety is what I had. I was working one day, and I was thinking again. Folks said thinking's dangerous. But I was thinking, and the thought crossed my mind that I never had trouble getting rid of anybody when I took a drink. And it's like the world opened up in the heavens. And this right excuse came down and just flittered right down into me. And I just started grinning. And I got drunk. I mean, I got real drunk. And I went home, and in 5 minutes, them folks were gone. I don't know what I said, but they were impressed because I was married to that lady for 9 years and I never saw them again. Now I want you to know, I didn't go back out there to drink to prove I wasn't an alcoholic. I knew I was an alcoholic by then. I went back out there and drank, folks, because the pain was so great trying to live this way of life and not growing spiritually. I couldn't stand it. It's one thing to be a phony on the streets. It's another thing to be a phony in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Them folks loved me. They cared about me. They wanted to see me sober, and I was bitter and resentful and hostile, and I don't know why they loved me, but they did. And I went back out there, and I was 24 years old. And I was going to drink till I was 40 years old. Because I figured, by God, at 40 you ought to throw in the towel and sober up anyway, I don't feel that way today, but I did then. And I went out there, and I didn't get any relief. I didn't get nothing. I got more pain and more misery and more remorse and more guilt than I ever had before, because every time I'd drink, I'd see them serene folks. Happy, peace of mind, joyous. I didn't get any relief. I got to thinking about those meetings that I'd been to. I got to thinking about, have you all ever heard the term surrender? I got to thinking about surrender. I got to drinking one day and started praying for surrender. Now that's dangerous. I want you all to be very careful what you pray for. Be very careful about it. I kept praying for it. I had my own conception of surrender. My conception of surrender is that somebody was going to take me out in the country to this secluded area and put me in this cabin and line the walls with cases of beer, and they're going to let me drink until I surrendered. Now that was what I was praying for. God had another idea, you know. On August the 16th of 1970, I was on another 4-day running drunk in a blackout, been thrown out of another joint, and I was driving back to Amarillo, Texas on the Old Fritch Highway, and I come out of a blackout right out there where the Old Fritch Highway curves into Amarillo Highway, and I saw an orange reflector spot, and that's what brought me out of this blackout. And it was on a concrete pole, and it was standing on a concrete medium, and I hit the brakes, and that car nosed down, and I was doing, they said, in excess of 90, and the bumper caught that concrete and started flipping end over end. And it flipped way on out there. And when it come to rest, that car was wrapped around me like a tin can. I couldn't move. I could move my left arm and my head, and that was all. My head was pinned to the floorboard, and every time I'd move it, the glass was like sandpaper. I'd move it. And I reached around with this arm, and I grabbed that steering column, and I jerked, and I jerked, and I jerked, and I almost jerked it out of the socket to where it was useless, and I couldn't budge. And the reason I was doing all that jerking, because there was gas dripping on my face and on my head. And I knew in a minute that the ignition electrical system in that car was going to ignite that gasoline, and I was going to burn to death, and I was scared. I was so scared that I knew I was going to die of fright. I'd get right to the point to where my heart was going to burst, and I'd say, God, please help me, and I'd slow down. And I'd lay there, and I'd get to thinking again. God damn, that's dangerous thinking. And I'd think about all this stuff, and I'd think about that gas, and I'd think about, and I'd get right to the point of almost bursting again, and I'd say, God help me, and I'd slow down. Now I want you to know that I have prayed when I was drinking. I used to pray, God, if you just get me out of this deal, I'll never drink again. Heard that somewhere forward there. Just get me out of this mess, and I'll never drink again. And I'd walk across the street, and I'd start toasting my good luck. You know, forget all about God. You know, I skated one more time. You know, I was real bright back then, you know. I was doing some praying this night, too. It's a little different. You know, after I laid there and this went on and on and on, and it finally dawns on me that I'm going to die, and I didn't have any more aces up my sleeve, and I didn't have any more options. The thought of dying finally became an appealing thought to me. Because when I remembered all that I'd gone through trying to not drink and be a phony, it would have been a hell of a lot easier to die. Right? The only problem was, how was I going to die? So I was praying. And I was doing some heavy-duty praying. I said, God, I don't mind dying. Just let me die. Don't let me burn to death. And God, let me go upstairs. Don't let me go downstairs. Hell, I knew where I wanted to go, you know. I was negotiating. I wasn't very smart, but I knew how to negotiate, you know. This went on and on and on and on and on. I laid in that car for over an hour with that deal going on and on and on and on. And finally I heard this train whistle. And I thought they're going to drive by, and they're going to stop, and they're going to see me. And I've been praying steadily for an hour, right? About getting close to God. And they're going to stop, and they're going to see me, and they're going to get out, and they're going to get me out of this car, and my luck's still holding. Forgot about God, about praying, and everything. The only trouble was that car started vibrating, and it started filling up with light, and I was right in the middle of that old boy's railroad. And all I had time to do was close my eyes and grit my teeth and say, God, please help me. And that train hit that car and knocked it a quarter of a mile, and it sheared off the back of that thing like stainless steel. And when it come to rest, I was right where I had been and couldn't move. And I was waiting for it to catch on fire, because I knew as soon as the train hit it, it had to, and it didn't. And I was laying there, and I heard these guys running down from this engine, and I thought, God bless, somebody's going to be smoking and throw down a damn cigarette, and I'm going to burn anyway, you know. And I started screaming, stay away, my God, don't come around this deal. You know, they finally cut me out of that car. They had them Jaws of Life just come out on the market back then. Neat deals. They got me out of that deal. I come out, I didn't know if I was hurt or not, but I was so glad to get away from that car. I just sprung out of that automobile, and there was a policeman standing there, and he wanted to talk to me. He wanted to ask me what happened. I decked about 8 or 10 people by that time. They were all standing around there. And I was trying to get as far from that car as I could, and they all jumped on me and threw me down. And they tied me up and they handcuffed me and they hauled me off to jail. No, they didn't. They stopped at the hospital, the emergency room. They wouldn't treat drunks back then. This little old red-headed nurse come in there and wiped the glass and the blood off my face, and they carried me to jail. And I was handcuffed in this kind of holding room down there, and they were next door. And they had them vents and them doors, and I was sitting in there, and I heard this young rookie over there, and he was ready to bury me. He had a list of charges on me that would put me under that jail. And I heard, and I didn't know it, but there was an old-time sergeant over there that had been in the police force there for years and years, and he looked at that rookie, and I didn't know, but I heard him say to that rookie, if you do what you're planning on doing, and they go in there, and you do that to him, he's going to snap, and he's never going to be worth nothing to nobody. And they gave me one charge. Failure to control an automobile and a skid. That's what they gave me. You talk about God working. You know, I called my wife, she come and got me, they took me home. I was a scab from the top of my head to the tip of my toes. I was black and blue all over. I could barely hobble around. Every time I'd try to lay down, I'd see that light and I'd hear that whistle and I'd get scared. And I'd jump back up and I'd pace some more. At 6:30, 7 o'clock the next morning, she springs out of that bed, throws them clothes on. She's getting ready to go to work. And I said, where are you going? She said, by God, I'm going to work. I said, no, you're not. I'm scared. She said, you always told me you were big enough to get out of any damn thing you got into. Now show me. And she went to work. You know, that's the best thing that woman ever did for me. Because I stayed around there about an hour and I couldn't handle it. And I called AA, and a guy come out there and got me from AA. A young man got me from AA, and he picked me up and he took me down there. I had to sign some papers on that car and release that deal. And I got down there and I look in that car, and that car, there's enough room in there for about the size of a German Shepherd to lay down on that floorboard, and I weighed 200 and some pounds at that time. And right there in the seat was a picture of me and a gal out at the Playboy Lounge the night before, and the thought hits me that I threw that lady out of the car and she's laying dead in the ditch out there somewhere, and I can't tell anybody. And they carry me over this little house in Amarillo. It's called the Recovery Center. It had been open 2 weeks. They just cleared the rodents out of there. And I walk up there, kind of hobble up there, and I knock on the door, and they come out, and Billy's standing there, and I said, Billy, will you help you? And he said, yeah, come on in. And I get in there, and I'm sitting in his office, and I'm shaking, and I'm scared, and I don't know what to do. And I'm looking at him, and I said, Billy, it ain't worth it. It ain't worth it. I'm just going to go kill myself. He said, why? I said, by God, if I got to go through all this to go back out there and go through what I've been through, I might as well be dead. I can't handle this deal. And he picked up a copy of the book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he said, Bud, this is precisely how we recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And if you're willing to go to any lengths, and if you're willing to practice these principles in your daily life, and if you'll do this deal, one day at a time, you never have to take another drink as long as you live. But he said, Bud, it takes more guts to stay sober than it does to take a drink. You know? He promised me I could recover. He told me no pansies in Alcoholics Anonymous. There ain't no pansies in AA. And some reason that man knew where to get me. And I sat around there that day, and I shook, and I talked, and there were some guys in there that just come out of Skid Row, and they were sitting there, and they were talking to me, and they were loving me, and they were just in there to get the wrinkles out of their stomach, and they were going to go on down the road. But they loved me because they saw a fear in me and a hopelessness and a desperation. And they sat there and they held my hand and they talked to me. And that afternoon they said, Bud, come on in here. And I kind of hobbled in the other room, and the TV was going, and they showed a picture of this fat boy coming out of this car, knocking all these people down, and said, Bud Nelson, who my parents were, who I worked for. And I thought, my God, I can't even walk around this town anymore and hold my head up. And then one of the things that happened was his wife come out of there and looked at me and saw that written all over my face, and she said, don't take yourself so damn serious, Bud, to be some other idiot on there tonight at 10 o'clock, and there was. There was. And the next morning, you know, these guys had talked to me all night long, and they'd held my hand, and they got me through the night, and I got up the next morning, and I was kind of hobbling around, and a white Chevrolet pulls up out front, right? My dad's white Chevrolet pulls up out front. And my heart leaped in my throat, and I guarantee you, I knew I was going to I knew I was in deep trouble. You know, I knew when he got in there, I was going to hear some things that I didn't really want to hear, you know. And I was scared to death, and I couldn't go nowhere. I could barely move. And he walks in there, and the only physical contact, close contact, my dad and I had. There wasn't no patting and loving and shaking hands and kissing and hugging shit. Excuse me. None of that went on in my home, you know. He taught me how to use the boxing gloves when I was 5 years old, you know. And he comes in there, and he's a bricklayer and a big man, and he walks over to me, and he's got tears running down his eyes, and he puts his arms around me, and he hugs me, and he said, "Bud, if it took all this for you to finally get to the point where you can surrender, it's all worth it. It's all worth it." And he turned around to Billy, and he said, "Help this guy," and he walked out. And I walked back in the furthest corner of that old house, and I shut the doors all the way back, because I was still worried about my image. And I got back there in a utility closet, and I got down on my knees. And I said, "God, please help me. Please help me. I'll do anything. I'll surrender unconditionally." And I got up off my knees, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel alone anymore. For the first time in my life, that empty hole inside of me started to disappear. And I walked out there, you know, and I sat down. And I told Billy, "I'll do whatever it takes." And we started going to meetings. And he started working with me. And he started teaching me what the steps meant. And every day he'd see me, he'd ask me, and he saw me every day. He said, "What step are you working on?" And I told this story earlier this afternoon. By God, if I told him I was on the same step too many days in a row, he'd say, "When's the big day?" And I'd say, "What day are you talking about?" He said, "When are you going to get drunk?" I said, "I ain't going to get drunk." He said, "Yeah, you are." I said, "No, I'm not." He said, "Yeah, you're procrastinating." I hate that word, procrastinating. He'd say, "You're procrastinating, and by God, that's a sure sign that you're going to get drunk." I said, "Wait a minute." I said, "There's a slogan down there at that AA club that says, 'Easy does it.'" He just started shaking his head, and he said, "As sick as you are, you better hurry every chance you get, you know." He said, "That don't apply to you." I got to hurry every chance I get now. Hell, time. I want you to know, I was sober about 3 weeks. By God, I'd slept all night long. You know what I want when I got the program of Alcoholics Anonymous? I want to be able to sleep all night long. I want to be able to walk around and not have to apologize for my existence. I wanted to experience a new freedom and a new joy and a new happiness. I had a spiritual experience when I was 3 months sober. I brushed my teeth and I didn't have the dry heaves anymore. That don't sound like a big deal to you folks, but I didn't know you had whites in your eyes for 3 months. They were blood red every day, every day. I started walking around, and that gut-wrenching fear started to leave me. I kept working the steps. I got down to working that. I didn't work these steps because I wanted to grow spiritually. I backed into this deal. I wouldn't work a step until I got right to the jumping-off point, you know, where you either get drunk and work a step. I'd work a step. You know, I was really motivated, because if I didn't work a step, I was going to die. I'd work the step, I'd find this happiness and peace and joy, you know. I'd ride that deal smooth out to the bitter end, you know. No sense getting any momentum and wasting it, you know. By God, I'd work that step, I'd ride it out, I'd get right to the point where I was going to crash and burn. I'd work the next step, you know. I hated to work that 4-step. Somebody's talking about how long are you supposed to wait till you work the 4-step today? Just until you're getting ready to lose your mind, you know. And when you're about ready to lose your mind, you work a step. And I wrote that step down, you know, and I got it written down, and I was home free. I felt good for about 24 hours. Because 24 hours later, my sponsor says, "When are you going to take the 5th step?" I said, "Well, I'm not going to take it with you." He said, "Well, who are you going to take it with?" And this thought popped through my mind. There's this Catholic priest that I knew. Busy man, real busy man, real involved. I knew people that had been going to him to get counseling. It was weeks before they could get in to see him, right? I'm getting brighter in my sobriety, see. I told him, I said, I'm going to see Father Francis. Okay, call him. Why don't you use my phone? Well, hell yeah, I'll use your phone. I picked up that phone and I called him. He said, why don't you come right on down, bud? I just had a cancellation. Billy's higher power was more potent than mine at that time. I went down there and I walked in there and I read that deal off to him and I talked to him and I'd get down that list and I knew I was getting close to one of them baddies, you know. You do that deal where you read it off, and I knew it was coming, and I'd get there and it'd catch right here. And the only thought that run through my mind when it caught right here is, if you don't do this deal right, you're going to get drunk and you're going to die. And I did it. And I did it. And I did it. And I walked out of that office, and for the first time in my life, folks, I hadn't copped out. For the first time in my life, I'd bought the whole package, the whole ball of wax, no reservations. And for the first time in my life, I knew I was going to be sober. I knew I was going to be sober. It talks about our sanity returning to us. It talks about in the big book of looking down the road and seeing yourself sober, and that's a sign. And by God, that's what happened to me. And I knew, and I felt, and I experienced that. And it's the neatest deal in the world, people. It's the neatest feeling in the world to finally come out and belong. And I belonged. And I didn't wish to shut the door on it anymore. I had no fear connected with the past. And I told some things that I swore I'd carry to my grave. And I didn't care anymore. I didn't care because by God, God's light was shining and I could feel it and I could feel that warmth, you know. And I was walking on a cloud, and I was working these steps, and I was carrying that message, and I was growing. And coincidences and miracles and all those things were happening in my life. And I was doing good, and I was reaching out, and I was trying to help. And then one day I heard a voice from somebody that was a friend of mine, supposedly, and he said, by God, you could do better for your family than what you're doing. You could buy them a better house, and you could do all this stuff and make them feel appreciated. And I did. And I lost it. Talks about the clamors of the world in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Those clamors of the world are eat your lunch. Them clamors of the world are suck that lifeblood of that stuff right out of you, man. And I bought that house, and I did that deal, and I made that money, and I went through that thing, and I tried my best to recapture this deal, and I couldn't. And I kept plugging. And I kept doing all these things, and there was something gone. Somebody put out the pilot light in my life. And I was married to that lady 4 years, and we got divorced. So what did I do? I get me another one. And I marry this lady, and I buy her 5 houses in 4 years. I try to find a place to get her comfortable. I try to get her all the things she needs. I try to do everything. I test the wind every day when I come home from work to see which way it's blowing to find out if I'm going to have a good evening. I do all these things because I just want to feel good, and I want to feel loved, and I want to feel all these things that I'd felt a few years earlier. And I was still going to meetings, and I was still working the steps, and God was still with me, folks. He had to be. And then that deal goes by the wayside. 7 years. And I can't let go of it. And the pain and the heartache and the misery is so great. And I can't let go of it. And it's just eating my lunch. And I'm walking around one day and I said, God, I wish you'd just reach down and just tear this pain right out of my heart. 10 days later, I'm laying in a coronary care unit in Lubbock General Hospital. And that prayer comes through my mind, and cold shivers run up and down my spine, and I remember. And I remember there's only one higher power from now on. And I tried another deal, and I'm still growing, and I'm trying to wrap this deal up, but I don't want to wrap it up too quick. You know, there's a little story I tell. It's about a guy that was over in Hawaii, and he got caught all up in this The sun's set and these beautiful colors and everything, and he stumbles and falls off this cliff. And he grabs hold of this vine, and he's hanging there. And there's 1,000 feet straight down, nothing but jagged rocks, water, sharks, every bad thing you can think about. And he's hanging on to this deal, and he's looking down, and he's scared to death, about like I was when they opened that curtain a while ago. And he looks down there, and he looks up there, and he said, "Is there anybody up there that'll help me?" And nothing. Is there anybody? I mean, anybody? Nothing. God, if there was just somebody up there, I'd do anything. And this booming voice comes out of the sky and says, "I'll help you, Fred." Fred said, "Who's that?" Said, "It's God, Fred." "Oh, God, it's so good to hear from you. You know, I'm really glad to hear from you, God. You going to help me?" "Yeah, I'm going to help you, Fred." "Let go, Fred." Fred looks down there. It's 1,000 feet down there, them jagged rocks. That water. You know what Fred does? He looks back up there and he said, "Is there anybody else up there that'll help me?" I did that deal. And I went through that deal, you know. And the people in AA and the love in AA and reaching out and the service work and all the things that I had to go through kept me sane and kept me sober. But I lost that glow. I tried marriage, it didn't work. Lasted 6 months, I think. Mistake. I was traveling around the country, been traveling, living out of a suitcase, working around, doing different things, making good money, couldn't find any happiness or peace of mind. Get a call from Amarillo, Texas. My folks say, "You need to come home, Dad's sick." I drive home, my dad's terminally ill. I go back, get my stuff, and I move back to Amarillo, Texas. I didn't want to be in Amarillo, Texas. I hadn't been there in 14 years. I go back home, and I got Mom in the hospital and Dad in the hospital, Mom in the hospital, Dad in the hospital. I'm going crazy. I go in the program of Al-Anon in June of 1985. I walk in the doors after 15 years sober almost, and I go in there, and I ask those ladies and those guys in there, would they please help me? I'm going crazy. Because I couldn't blow my image out front. And they help me. And they love me. And they teach me to release. And they teach me to love. And they teach me to quit trying to change my father who's dying. And quit trying to make a relationship out of the deal. And accept him and love him. And I find out that I'm not different than my dad. I'm just like him. And I've been running for all these years trying to prove I was different. And I'm like him. And I find out it's a neat to be like him because he's a good man. He's a good man and he's got a good faith and he loves me. And you know what they did for me? They let me love him. And they let me release him and they let him die in dignity. And they let me get close to him and I'd never been close to him. And that's a miracle. And my mother's an invalid. She'd had open heart surgery 7 years ago, 3 strokes, and I'm staying there. And for the first time in my life, there's a woman that can hold me in one place, and it's my mother. And I got the neatest relationship going that I've ever had in my life. And I'm learning how to love and accept and interact. You don't think God don't work in this deal? You don't think miracles don't come around? It's not the quantity of sobriety you got, folks, it's the quality. It ain't the number of registered people at this convention, by God. It's what's going on here. It's that spirit and that love and that fellowship and that willingness to go to any length and to love each other back to health. And there's a story I'm going to share with you, and then I'm going to sit down. And before I tell you this story, I'm going to tell you, I didn't do this deal tonight. God did. Because I've been just as surprised with this stuff as you have, because I turned it over before I got up here, and I've been listening, and it ain't bad, you know. And there's a story I want to tell you, and I want you to write this one down, folks, because this is the most important story I'm going to tell you tonight. There's a story about the angel Gabriel and God, and they were standing up there at the pearly gates, and somebody was talking about boredom today, and God got bored. And he looked at Gabriel and he said, "By God, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make earth." And Gabe said, "All right." I mean, he was impressed, you know. So God makes earth. and he makes the oceans, and he makes the rivers, and he makes the ground, and he makes the trees, and he makes all this beautiful stuff, you know. And he's just having a hell of a good time, and Gabe's just standing there shaking his head, and he's really impressed, you know. And he makes the animals, and he makes the birds, and everything's going great, and then he makes man. And he's still impressed. You can see Gabe over there. He's really on a roll, and he's getting excited, you know. And then God reaches down there and gives man a free will. And Gabe starts shaking his head. And God looks over at him and he said, "What are you doing shaking your head?" He said, "God, I've known you for a long time, right?" And he said, "Right." He said, "I've always been impressed with what you could do, right?" "Right." He said, "For the first time since I've known you, you just screwed up." He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Don't you know if you give them folks down there a free will, they may decide to turn their back on you and just walk away." "Yeah, they might do that." "Well, doesn't that scare you?" He said, "No." "Why doesn't it?" He said, "Because I left a little bitty void inside of each and every one of them, and I'm the only thing that can fill it. And I came to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, folks, and you all filled that void for me with my God. Thank you very much."